The topic of today's seminar will be Data Inside, which is considered a formal subject within the Mindset curriculum. There are various types of questions in this section, many of which most students are not very familiar with. Among them, I think the second most difficult type is what's called two-point analysis, double columns. Double column analysis means there is a multiple choice question on the left and another on the right, and they actually share the same set of options. You need to pick one option for the left and one for the right. For questions like this, today we're going to show you how to tackle them. Let's first take a look and understand the essence of DI. I think a lot of students are afraid of the BI subject because in the traditional GMAT or the old GMA or previous exams, most of the questions were single choice with 5 options. 4 choice or 5 choice questions just ask you to pick one, so you're already very familiar with that format. Also, most of those questions were mainly text-based. So we tend to feel like, oh, we can handle it because the amount of information isn't that much, and there aren't many different types of information either. Plus, all you're required to do is pick one answer, so you don't get too nervous. But DI is quite different from that. DI, this subject, has 3 main characteristics. Let's first take a look right now. We're not just talking about TPA, but focusing on the features of the DI subject itself. The 3 main characteristics of this subject are as follows. The first is that all the questions are application-based. In RCCR section, you might encounter some questions that test your abstract logic. For example, things like delivering packages on Monday, newspapers on Tuesday, and building materials on Wednesday. These are clearly specially designed questions meant to test your pure logic skills, rather than scenarios you'd actually encounter in real life. Situations that would actually happen. On the math side, you'll encounter pure math questions, not application problems. When you look at your score report, you'll notice that math is divided into 2 categories, one labeled pure and the other labeled real. So in those 2 subjects, verbal and quant, you might encounter questions that have nothing to do with stories. They might test you purely on logic or pure math. But in the DI section, every single question is an application problem. Every question is about solving a case. It's that simple. So as long as we're talking about DI, all the questions are application-based. This can be a disadvantage, but it can also be an advantage. As for the disadvantage, who is it a disadvantage for? It's for people who don't read quickly or whose reading skills aren't strong. They tend to prefer the kind of math questions where you're given numbers and formulas directly. But if you're given a story instead, it becomes awkward and exhausting for them. So for these people, it's a disadvantage. So for whom is it an advantage? It's an advantage for those who know how to use the substitution method. What is the substitution method? There's a type of test taker in this world who makes up less than 10% of all students, but among high-scoring students, they account for over 90%. The characteristic of these people is that whenever they read any text or solve any problem, they habitually put themselves into the role of one of the people involved in the question. If you already know that the essence of DI questions is application questions, and you take the initiative to put yourself into the role of the person involved in the reading of the article or the problem-solving process, you will do very well in DI. So the first thing I would like to remind you is that you should use the substitution method. Put yourself into a character's role. The second characteristic of DI questions is this. There will be a lot of text. Among all the DI question types, the one with the least text is probably DST, data sufficiency. Other types, like TPA tables, might also have relatively little text. But for something like MSR, the amount of text can be extremely high. But there's a particular feature, even though there's a lot of text, what about it? The proportion of important information in the text is actually much lower. Which section has the highest proportion of important information? That would be verbal CR. In CR, almost every 3 sentences or so, each one is pushed either a premise, evidence, or a conclusion. Next, the section with the second highest proportion of important information is RC. I've calculated that in a typical passage, about 50% of the information is likely to be tested. But the section with the lowest information density is DI, including questions like TPA and MSR, which are those multi-tab questions or the dual difficulty questions that we'll talk about in a moment. Often, the information that will actually be tested in these questions might only account for 20% or even just 10% of the entire passage. So there's a lot of irrelevant information. Now, how do you identify this irrelevant information? That's exactly what we'll be focusing on next. What methods can help you avoid unrelated details, focus only on the information relevant to the questions, and then answer them smoothly. All right, so a lot of students tell me, Dustin, I actually feel like there isn't enough time for this test. I can never finish the DI section. And then they say, 45 minutes for 20 questions, shouldn't I be given more time? But actually, it is possible to finish. The key is knowing how to distinguish between useful and useless information. So the most important part of preparing for DI and my main focus in class, like when using news articles, is not simply training you to spot the latest exam topics. Because in the entire DI section, it doesn't test you on anything new. Unlike the old format, which had sentence correction where you had to know grammar and idioms, everything in DI is based on what you already know. It's an overlap of the skills from Quant and the RC and CR abilities from verbal. You don't need to learn any new skills. But when I teach DI, I always emphasize that while you don't need to study new abilities, you do need to first learn the problem-solving process. because the question types include both charts and text, and the format is not the typical 5-choice single answer question. Plus, as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of irrelevant information. So today, what I want to teach you is the important problem-solving process for DI, which starts with TPA. So to sum up, DI has 3 main features. The first is that it requires a lot of data extraction and application. The second is that there's a lot of text. And the third is that there's a lot of irrelevant information. That's why the problem-solving process is even more important. Now, let's take a look at what the key points are for the TPA questions we're going to discuss today. First of all, for the first TPA question, you'll notice its main feature looks like this. There will be a passage of text, and this passage usually contains quite a lot of words. It has more text than what you encounter in math questions, and even more than what you see in CR. It's somewhere between CR and RC in terms of length, about the same as a short passage in RC. That's the type of question we're dealing with here. How much time should you spend on it? Personally, I would not recommend spending 2 minutes and 15 seconds on each question. Where does this number come from? It's calculated by dividing 45 minutes by 20 questions, which is the total time and number of questions for the entire DI section. If you divide it directly like this, the time will be 2 minutes and 15 seconds. But this time is not suitable for TPS. I would suggest that for TPA questions, you should spend about 2.5 to 3 minutes. You might say, but Dustin, if that's the case, the math doesn't add up. Wouldn't that mean I'm overspending my time? You have to remember that within the entire DI section, the type of question that can help you save time is another type called data sufficiency, or DS. That's because DS questions have less text. Why is there less text? Because it's just a question stamped plus 2 conditions. And for the 5 answer choices, you don't need to reread the DS question each time. The 5 options are always fixed. For every question, it's about whether condition 1 alone is sufficient, condition 2 alone, both together, each separately, or neither will. So with DS questions, you have the least amount of reading to do. And then what else about DS questions? For many of these questions, you really don't need to actually calculate the answer, right? As long as you follow the basic logic, whether it's mathematical rules or fundamental mathematical reasoning, you just need to determine whether the value is unique. And that's enough to answer DS questions. I would suggest that everyone aim to finish these in 1.5 to 2 minutes, which is even faster than the average time. This way, you can save time. And who do you save this time for? For TPA. Why? Because the unique feature of the TPA screen is that it presents 1 question, but you're actually answering 2 questions, right? That's what it is. Although it looks like a single page on the surface, in reality, it's 2 multiple choice questions, and you have to solve both at once. You're just sharing the same information and the same set of options. That's all. So when you're answering 2 questions like this at once, our average time per question can be a bit slower. We can stretch it to about 2.5 to 3 minutes, but it's not recommended to go over 3 minutes. If you go beyond 3 minutes, it means you've used up almost the time for 2 questions on just 1. And in that case, you'll definitely have trouble keeping pace during the exam. The second thing to be aware of is that TPA itself actually has 2 types. One type is math-oriented TPA, and the other type is logic-oriented TPA. We can simply call them math-related or non-math related. You can actually see this reflected in your score report. When you open your score report, there's a table that shows the type of each question. For the 2-part next section, it will indicate whether it's math-related or non-math related. If it's math-related, when you look at the question during the exam, you'll notice that all the answer choices are numbers, or there will be a lot of numbers in the passage itself. You can tell right away that it's math-related, even before you read the question. However, if it's a logic-related question, you'll hardly see any numbers at all. Just look here. There aren't really any numbers shown. And then what? Then, in this part, there really aren't any numbers for you to see. This is what we call a logic-related question. And it's also the main focus of what we're going to talk about today. Today, we'll be discussing the so-called non-math-related TPA questions. So let's talk about that. The problem-solving process will be a bit different. If it's a math-related question, I would suggest that you first read the passage, then look at the question by question. I mean, the actual question being asked, and then proceed to do the calculations to find the answer. There's no need to look at the options first, because firstly, looking at the options doesn't make sense. They're just numbers. See what it's asking you to do, the second point. There's no point in looking at the question first. You really need to read through the passage first. Understand what numerical relationships are already given in the passage, and then look at the question so you know how to piece everything together to solve it. So if it's a math-related question, like the math section of the TPA, I would suggest you just follow this process step by step. Start with the passage, then work through the equations, and finally make your selection. But if it's a logic-related question that is the non-mathematical type of TPA, then you'll need a completely different problem-solving approach. This is quite different from what we just discussed for the math-related questions. So what is this completely new problem-solving approach? First of all, I recommend that you prepare your scratch paper. You might ask, what is the scratch paper for? I suggest that when you're working on TPA questions, you draw 5 horizontal lines directly across your scratch paper, just like this. I also recommend that you space these 5 lines a bit farther apart. Let me show you what these lines look like, just like this. The reason I suggest leaving more space between the lines is that these 5 lines can be used for other types of questions as well. For example, some questions might ask you whether the calculated value of A is greater than B. For certain math-oriented questions, these 5 lines will create 6 separate sections. For instance, the first section might be used when the question asks about 5 different scenarios, or sometimes 3 scenarios. Oh, so for questions like which number is bigger, A or B? For comparison questions like this, you can do your calculations right here. That's why it's useful to make the boxes a bit larger and leave more space between them. Some options require you to actually do the calculations. And if you work within each box, your calculations won't get mixed up with others. That's the idea here, yes. This area is for the calculation of statement 1, and this area is for the calculation of statement 2. Or in the ESC, it's the same. You have separate calculations for condition 1 and condition 2. And then when you combine the 2 conditions, you do the calculation for both together. This way, you won't accidentally mix them up. So what about when you're working on the verbal section? In that case, you can use it directly for elimination. Okay, so you can just say this is option A and this is option B. Keep option C and eliminate the other options. This way, it's really convenient and actually quite effective. I used to use my fingers. I used to count with my fingers, like, oh, this is A, B, C, and so on, ticking them off like that. But don't forget one thing. There are 2 sets of options, and you haven't finished both sets yet, so you can't move on to the next question. You can't exactly use both your left and right hands at the same time, right? If you try to use both hands together, in the end, you'll still have to go back and check, like, oh, I picked B here, and I picked 1 there. So matching B with honor dozen, that seemed kind of silly. That's why I suggest you just draw a staff, 5 lines to separate 6 boxes. This way, whether you're doing math or not, you won't get things mixed up, and you can easily separate your answers. This is what's called an answer sheet. If you understand this, could you type a 2 for me? Is that okay? Now, why do we draw 6 boxes? You don't have to draw just 5, 6 is enough, because TPA will have up to 6 options at most. As you see in some of the questions we'll look at in a moment, some of them like this one have 6 options, and some math questions have 6 numbers. So at most, you draw 5 lines, which gives you 6 boxes. Then, when you're working on non-math types, that is the more logic-based TPA questions, I strongly recommend that you start by reading the question itself first. First, understand what the question is actually asking. It's not quite the same as math. In math, reading the question first is useless because you don't even know what the original numbers or relationships are. Reading the question first doesn't make any sense. You might as well read the passage first. But for TPA, I strongly recommend that you read the question first. In fact, if the answer choices aren't too long, you can even sneak a peek at them. Of course, if the choices are long, you can just glance at 1 or 2. For example, let's look at a question in a moment. For questions like this, you can take a quick look at all 5 answer choices to see what kind of options there are. That way, you'll know how to approach answering the question or what direction you should be thinking in. Because with TPA, even though it's testing logic, the answer choices usually aren't as long as those in CR. Take a look at these options. They're not as long as CR options. So you can take a sneak peek first, get familiar with the question and the answer choices. That way, when you start thinking about it, you'll have a better idea of how to answer. But if you come across options that are as long as those in C-ROM, for example, in cases like that, I would suggest you still look, but just check 1 or 2 options instead. It's not that you need to decide right away whether to eliminate or keep an option after looking at it, because you really have no way of knowing at this point. It's just that by glancing at them first, you get a general idea of what the answers look like. So you'll know what to expect when you answer later. So this is a special point. It's a bit different from CR because most of the options here are shorter than those in CL. That means we can take this opportunity to sneak a peek at the options in advance. This way, you'll have a sense of what to expect in your mind, what the question stem and the answer choices actually look like. Only then will you know what form they take. When you read the passage later, you'll know which direction your thinking should go. Here's the key point. First, look at the question stem and the answer choices. If there are a lot of answer choices, just look at 1 or 2. If there aren't many, quickly glance through all 5. Of course, you should also try to connect the question stem to the types of CRT questions we usually encounter, like weaken, support, explain, or fill in the blank. Or maybe it belongs to the types we usually do in RCP, like main idea, inference, or function questions, and so on. You need to connect it to a specific question type and then use the solving methods and key points you've learned for those specific CR or RC question types to answer it. So in fact, you won't need to use any new skills. Now, here's the main point. The question stem is extremely important. Look, I've even typed it out for you. The question stem is super important because, first of all, as we just mentioned, there's a lot of irrelevant information in TPA. So how do you filter out the irrelevant information and figure out which information might not be what the question is asking for? Careful reading of the question stem can help you do this. The second thing is, how do you know which role you need to take on, right? Just now, we mentioned that using substitution makes it easier for you to answer questions and to think. The question stem can also help you determine which role you should take on. And then in TPA, because there are 2 columns, I strongly suggest that you don't work on both columns at the same time. Why? First, you need to understand this. In CPA, there are also 2 columns. How many possible combinations are there in total? 5 options times 5 options equals 25 combinations, right? Pay attention, not like, if you pick one on the left, you can't pick it on the right. In TPA, you're allowed to choose the same option for both the left and right columns. That's possible. So it's not like choosing one from 5 and choosing one from the remaining 4. It's not without replacement. It's with replacement. So this becomes 5 times 5, which is 25 possible cases. So what if you don't fix one side before doing the other? it's possible that you'll end up selling this. It's just how math works. So for most problems, we usually choose to do one at a time, okay? But for some special problems, what do we choose? We choose to do them together. In a moment, we'll look at which types of problems are suitable to do together. Basically, most of the problems that are done together are what? Most of them are fill-in-the-blank questions. Let me write it down for you. For the vast majority of problems, we want to fix one part before working on the other. But what kind of problems do we do together? These are the so-called fill-in-the-blank or sentence completion questions. For example, if A, then B, if the first blank is if, then the second blank is then. These two must be matched together. So in these cases, you would choose to do them together. But how do you decide which one to do first and which one to do later? The criteria we use to determine which blank to answer first include things like which one has more constraints, which one is the underlying factor behind the other, or which one is the deciding factor for the other. It could also be an if-then relationship or something like a cause and effect relationship. All right, of course, this requires practice, and I'll demonstrate it for everyone in a moment. And finally, when we're working through these options, we always use the process of elimination. So if you stay until the end, I'll give you this page and you can come back to review it. Let's quickly go over it again. First, draw a star with 5 lines and divide your scratch paper into 6 wide sections. These 6 points are convenient for you to do, and you don't need to do them by hand. It is also very convenient for you to do other math problems. The second one is not to read the text first, but to read the questions and options first if the options are too long. Even just looking at 1 or 2 options first can help you know how to think about the third point. Quickly relate this question to similar types you've encountered in RCU or Quant 120 and use those methods to solve it well. For the fourth point, when you read the question, slow down and read carefully. The question can help you identify which parts of the passage are irrelevant information. It also helps you put yourself in the right mindset, making it easier for you to think through the problem. Fifth, in most cases, solve it once first, then go through it again. But which side should you solve first? It depends on whether the 2 blanks are independent of each other or interdependent. For example, when it comes to cause and effect, should you address the cause first or the result? For questions about problems and solutions, should you solve the problem first or the solution? For a small number of questions that are fill in the blank, it is recommended that you solve them together, especially for fill in the blank questions with similar conditions. Finally, when you look at the options, please use the process of elimination.